Hey everyone, Kristen from Maybe Better Wanna Knits here today to talk to you about sock knitting and to give you my top 5 tips for sock knitting. This is not really a video for people who want to learn to knit socks. That's going to be a separate video coming up in the future, but people who are already knitting socks and maybe looking to make that process a little more smooth and a little more successful. I'm going to share my top 5 tips for doing that with you today. I have been knitting socks probably since a year or two after I started knitting, which brings us up to about 12 years. And these days I tend to knit mostly plain vanilla socks. I really like hand knit socks. Obviously for the winter months, I've kind of mostly moved beyond using pattern socks and knit a lot of plain vanilla socks, but these tips will be for whatever kind of socks you might be interested in knitting. So let's start with number 1. My first tip is to learn to knit your socks toe up. I know this is very controversial. And people have different preferences for different reasons. The reason I say this is because if you knit your socks toe up, then before you start, you can take your skein or hank or whatever you want to call it of sock yarn, you can divide it in half, and then you can make the full use of that skein, that half a skein, because you'll be able to knit your socks until your yarn runs out, and then knit your second sock until the yarn runs out, and you will have 2 equally sized socks. And you can't really do this when you knit your socks cuff down unless you do an afterthought heel, and I don't like afterthought heels. So you're going to get the most use out of that skein of sock yarn if you knit toe up. Most patterns can be knit in either direction. It can take a little finagling with the stitch patterns or with the heel and whatnot, but it is possible. And of course, a plain vanilla sock can be knit in either direction, and it is relatively easy to change from one direction to the other. Sock toes are pretty standard, and most types of sock heels, which we'll talk about in a minute, can be knit in either direction as well. So while it can take a little maneuvering to figure it out, I highly recommend knitting your socks from the toe up just so that you can get the most out of your sock yarn. I really get tired of having little bits of sock yarn left over, of realizing I could have knit my socks longer, taller. You know, if that's if you knit ankle socks, that's a little bit different, but assuming you're knitting full length socks, it is really nice to be able to just knit until you run out of yarn and not worry about trying to compare your 2 socks and make sure the legs are the same length. So that is number 1, knit from the toe up. My second tip is to take the time to learn the different methods of needle placement for sock knitting and figure out which one works best for you. So that's basically going to be either DPNs, 2 circular needles, or magic loop. Give them all a try and see which one works best for you. I kind of go back and forth between 2 circular needles and magic loop, depending on what needles I have available. My preference is actually for 2 circular needles. It just makes dividing the stitches on either side of the foot of the sock and on either side of the leg a little bit easier, in my personal opinion. I never use DPNs anymore. I don't use DPNs for almost anything except for the tops of hats, and even that I will avoid when possible. I do not like DPNs. But this is not really about what I like. This is about learning what works best for you. So take the time to learn the different methods and see which one works best for, your knitting style and your comfort, and stick with that one. Any sock can be knit on DPNs, 2 circular needles, or 1 long needle for magic loop. In any direction. Rarely do I see sock patterns knit nowadays specifically for one style on the other or the other. They are usually already written in a way that you can use your preferred method. So I think back when I started knitting, pretty much everything was written for working on DPNs. So it would say put this many stitches on the first needle, the second needle, the third needle. And it's really not done that way anymore. It's more like put a marker halfway. And if you are using 2 circular needles or magic loop, you don't have to worry about a marker. You just divide it in half. So it doesn't really require a lot of pattern manipulation these days to use your preferred needle method. So highly recommend. Try them all and see which one works best for you. In a similar vein, number 3 is to find the heel that works for you. There are a lot of different heel styles. There's a traditional flap and gusset, there's short row, there's fish lips kiss, there's afterthought heels, there's just so many different kinds of heels. And they sort of work better or worse for different foot shapes. So as with tip number 2, my suggestion is to try them all out and figure out which one works best for you. And then it's relatively easy to substitute heels in socks, which is something that I do quite often. Personally, I like a heel flap and gusset. And I also like, I'm going to forget the name of this heel. It's developed by Just Run Knit. I'm gonna look it up. Hang
on. One eternity later.
It's the OMG heel by Megan Williams. I also like that one. Again, most of these heels can be adapted for toe up or cuff down. They can be adapted to fit into different stitch patterns because heels, are kind of separate mostly. There are some instances where it doesn't work that well. For example, some color work socks, the kind of heel that is provided in the pattern, it's not as easily substituted with other heels. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just requires a little bit more effort. But in general, heels are interchangeable. And it is a really good idea to try them out and see which style heel just fits your foot better. And then make that change in whatever sock pattern you are knitting. And once you hit a certain point, it's really not even going to be that big. Like, you're going to have memorized your heel because you're going to know pretty much your stitch count almost always for your socks. And you're just going to know how to knit your heels, and you can just put them in as appropriate. But definitely recommend try all the different heel styles and see which one works best for your personal foot structure. Number 4 is to make sure that you are knitting socks the right size. Socks are supposed to have negative ease. They are supposed to have about 10% negative ease. Most things that we knit do not have negative ease. But because we want to keep our socks from falling down, we want them to hug in around our foot. So if your foot has an 8-inch circumference, you do not want a sock with an 8-inch circumference. You want a sock with about a 7¼ inch circumference. That's about 10% negative ease, 0.8 inches. Measure your feet. This is important. Don't really go by your shoe size. Shoe size is it's a good jumping off point, but you're going to get something more accurate if you actually measure your foot. So for example, I wear a size 7.5 shoe, But when I wear boots, I wear an 8 because I want to wear my thicker hand-knit socks with my boots. So shoe size, again, it's a good jumping off point, but you are much better off actually measuring your foot, your bare foot, and using that. And it's not only the circumference, it's also the length of your foot. You want the sock, the foot length, so from toe to the back of the heel, you want this to be 10% shorter than your actual foot length from your toe to the back of your heel. So make sure you measure. There are some companies that make little like foot measure dealies, kind of like I don't even know if they have them anymore. They used to have in the old shoe stores in the 80s. They still do that? I don't know. Maybe. But it's just kind of like a little foot-shaped ruler so you can see. That's really only going to help you with your foot length though. And again, you need to do both. The circumference of your foot, so about the fullest part of your foot, which is usually going to be sort of right where your big toe, I'm like pointing at my feet, which you cannot see, but where your big toe joins your foot, that's really kind of the fullest part, and that's where you want to measure. Get that circumference, and then again, from the tip of the toe to the back of the heel, that length, and make sure that you are knitting your socks to a negative ease, 10% less than those measurements. Of course, this might mean you need to check your gauge. I don't recommend a gauge swatch for socks. I do recommend that once you've gotten your sock started and you have a decent amount of fabric, to check your gauge using that. And make adjustments accordingly. Yes, you might have to rip back, a few inches, but it's much easier and less annoying, I think, than trying to knit a small gauge swatch for a sock every time you knit socks. And my last one, this is not so much about knitting, but about the longevity of your socks. Most sock yarns are superwash merino, which is nice and soft on your feet, but it's just not very durable. So I'm not going to say never use it, but I'm going to say consider some non-superwash and non-merino sock wools if you're interested in socks that last a little bit longer and don't need to be repaired so often. I really like a Blueface Leicester for socks. It is just a little bit sturdier than the merino. It's still plenty soft. Definitely, you always want your sock yarn to have some nylon in it, which is going to make it sturdier. Even if you are using superwash merino, I recommend, at the very least, machine washing on a delicate cycle and line drying your socks. They will last longer. They will last even longer if you hand wash your socks, but maybe that's not feasible for everyone. But yeah, the superwash merino for socks, especially if you're wearing your socks a lot, it's just not that sturdy. So consider non-superwash wools because they're sturdier, and consider non-merino wools because they're sturdier. And there are some out there. They're certainly not as ubiquitous as superwash merino sock yarn, but they do exist. In my experience, they are harder wearing, and they will make socks that last longer. So just maybe get outside your comfort zone there and consider some different fiber content for your socks so that all that hard work that you put into them doesn't go to waste. So those are my top 5 tips to improve your sock knitting and make better fitting, longer lasting socks. I will be doing a series in the future for people who want to learn to knit socks. And if you want to be the first to hear about that, make sure you are subscribed to this channel or to my newsletter, and there's a link to that in the description box down below. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you next time.